The best way to predict the future is to create it. That's an Abraham Lincoln quote. What we're doing today is looking at how you can use money as a catalyst for change. What if rather than making endless rules and regulations, you could take ESG principles and the way they're funded shape the world from an environment, social and governance perspective and make it all pay for itself? So ESG is presenting us with a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make the changes today for the future in a way that our children and grandchildren will thank us for. And I've got 3 top brains from RMB to help us explain it all. Is it about the opportunity, Ashwin? Because so many people look at compliance as a compliance exercise and start ticking off. We're world leaders in corporate governance and King Codes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, how many we've had, and got to a point where we started having massive corporate failures because we stopped paying attention to the detail. Yes. I look at ESG slightly differently and wonder if this actually becomes the opportunity rather than this is the carrot rather than the stick.
Yes, I think, Bruce, that's absolutely it. The amount of capital that ESG and sustainable finance is going to attract over the next, I would say, 30 to 50 years is going to be enormous. And it's going to shape the world. So there's going to be new business models, new ways of thinking about the world. And I think banks have a critical role to play because banks in a market system channel capital to opportunities. And I think that's critical for us to facilitate. I'll also like to say that sustainability thinking is actually a transition story for us. Because, for example, in the developed markets, the infrastructure is built, the economies are strong and they can finance themselves. But in Africa, we've got real short to medium term societal challenges. And we need to think about a transition plan to balance that together with our long-term goals in sustainability.
I mean, Nigel, it's such an interesting thought, though, because we're putting out fires each and every single day across the African continent, and certainly in South Africa more often than not. I wonder whether or not the biggest constraint to ESG financing is the way we think about the world. We're too busy thinking about tomorrow and not necessarily 5, 10 years ahead, which more developed economies have got the luxury of doing.
I think you're right, Bruce. I think, very much, we do live in the moment. I think internationally there's very much more planning for the future, looking strategically where things are likely to end up. I mean, if you look at where the drivers of the market are coming from, so if you look at the drivers of the market being regulation, the regulation in South Africa is, generally focused on environmental approvals. It hasn't got yet to some of these other aspects, which we're starting to see internationally. We've recently seen, the last few years, obviously the introduction of carbon tax, but internationally there's been the EU emissions trading scheme for a long period of time. So we're somewhat behind the market from that perspective. I think also from a consumer awareness perspective. So if you think about consumers, internationally consumers are much more aware of green, they're aware of social, they're aware of what's happening in the supply chain. And I think that's quite interesting. So something that I found when I was at COP last year is if you look at a package, so if you buy something from a supermarket and you turn it over and you look at the back and you can see the energy content, the fat content, etc., we're going to get to a point very much not too far ahead where you'll actually have the environmental benefits or the disbenefits. So there'll be the carbon intensity of that specific product. So when I was in COP, there were 3 pies. One was plant-based, one was beef, and one was vegetarian. And I wanted the beef pie, but it had the highest CO2 footprint. So I actually chose the plant-based one, which was actually very, very nice. And I wouldn't have tried it otherwise. But what you're going to start seeing is a change in consumer behavior. But we're seeing that internationally and obviously starting to feed through into our market.
You can have the meat pie, but then you have to swim home.
Correct, exactly. What is your carbon footprint and how good do you feel about that?
Yeah, exactly right. How many bins do you have at home?
Well, 2 inside and 2 outside.
Okay. Are they separate bins for separate?
They are separate bins. So there's the recycling bin and there's the non-recycling bin, and outside there's the recycling bin and the non-recycling bin. But the same truck collects both and puts them together.
But that's the problem, isn't it?
But I still feel good about myself.
But doesn't that come down to the state of our evolution in terms of
right.
where we are? I have 1 bin. I don't even pretend because I don't know what's going to happen to it. 1 bin.
2 bins.
2 bins.
1 bin.
1 bin. I see, we're honest. We know it's going to end up. And this is, we can talk about this stuff until we're blue in the face, but until we appreciate the need for ESG as a daily requirement in our lives, and we're not worried about 350 Rand grants just to stop people from starvation. How realistic is it for us to play catch-up in the most unequal society on earth, where life and death issues are far more important than ESG?
So, I mean, first of all, when we look at ESG, there's also the social element. So sometimes I think people often think about sustainability as purely being a green element. So they think it's, totally focused on the climate element. There's a very strong social element to it as well. So even if you were to do, for example, renewable energy, that reduces emissions, that helps with health benefits for individuals, So there are benefits to the social element as well. And I think that the opportunity is not about us looking at the here and the now. It's looking ahead and saying, how do we direct capital flows into the country? And that's the way I'm seeing it, is that we need to be accessing the climate finance that's been agreed at COP. So COP agreed climate finance commitments, $500 billion over the next 5 years for essentially climate transition. And the idea is we need to be channeling that into the country to try and access that to move the economy forward, which is also going to have essentially social upliftment as well.
Coal is our single biggest bulk commodity. We export more coal than anything else, and it goes off to places like Bangladesh, and it goes to India, it goes to China, and it's a great revenue earner, export revenue earner. Should we be stopping?
I think, as with most things, we need to reevaluate, what's relevant and what's not as we go along. And I'll go back to the previous point, just to sort of lay down a principle. You look at the consumer and you say, in Europe, they look at, for instance, the carbon footprint of a product, whereas over here, it's life and death issue, it's a 350 Rand grant. And I think it's a problem that we see globally in that you've got green premiums, whereas the more environmentally products tend to be more expensive. Because, to track now the supply chain, to have that specialist packaging, you may not have the volume in your sustainable packaging that you have in the more hydrocarbon-based packaging. And so you have a cost differential, which means your initial adoption will be by consumers in higher earning countries, because they've got the ability to give expression to what they want to do. I think everyone all over the world wants to protect the earth. I mean, if you look at a continent like Africa as well, even traditionally land management, conservation, very entrenched in whatever culture you find on the continent, very close to nature, but that ability to pay, that's the differentiator. So similarly with industries like coal, hydrocarbons, etc., I think you're going to find an adoption curve, and part of that adoption curve, like you said, has to deal with social realities. And I think part of the work that Ashwin and Nigel is doing, when they talk of transition, and we asked, what is this transition? Doesn't mean we're not doing anything. That's exactly the question that they grapple with, which is to say, in the here and now, this is what we need, but there's a point that we need to go into the future, and that point looks different to how this looks. So how do we harness what we're doing now and take some of that and pay it forward so we've got a transition towards it? It's the same with the person looking at their carbon footprint. Certain places are high up on the adoption curve, other places are lower because of economic realities. And I think the work and the IP and the genius, if you will, in that is to find that bridge. And that's where I think a lot of financial institutions are really trying to play that role. So, there's no clear-cut answer, yes or no, but I think what we're saying is it's a moving target, it's a changing world, and everyone realizes everything has to become more sustainable. The question is, how do you become more sustainable without making unsustainable short-term choices?
Exactly.
That's the dichotomy between it.
I mean, do we do what Cortez did? And Cortez arrives, he wants to fight the Aztec Empire, and he burns the ships because he thinks it'll motivate his sailors and his soldiers to fight harder because there's no escape route. This is not the energy transition. This isn't the transition we're talking about. We're talking about a long, slow, and sustainable transition. That in itself frustrates a lot of people, because particularly more activist types who go, well, we need to act now, we need to act faster, because here are the goals and here are the targets, and we're missing every single target every single year. How do we make the process sustainable so that we also don't lose hope in the future?
I think, Bruce, an important concept is not carbon zero, it's carbon neutral. That it's a concept that the industry has anchored on.
So just stop messing up the environment, please.
A lot of participants in this market actually need help to advise them on how to get to this carbon net neutral state. And I have to say that it's not obvious. Now, banks play a role in that. And that's the role we've taken on to advise our clients to transition from today to a carbon net neutral position in the future, or sustainability.
Because, Nigel, I mean, money talks, right? So if you're not funding a particular activity, well, then that activity will eventually wither and die. And if you fund other more productive activities, more sustainable activities, those will flourish. But that doesn't also happen overnight.
No. So essentially what you would be looking to do is you'd be looking to incentivize the businesses of the future. And that's what we very much do. So in certain of our products, if it's going to be a green loan, it's going to price slightly better than, for example, a vanilla loan. Or there's sustainability-linked loans where there's a pricing benefit on the achievement of certain targets linked to certain ESG KPIs. So the idea is you essentially incentivizing the right behavior and the right corporates to move in the right direction.
Do we have a global standard, Nigel? Do we have a rule book that says this is ESG? These are the parameters, these are the rules, this is how we fund with a cookie-cutter approach? Because that would simplify things considerably, wouldn't it?
No, but they're trying. So I think, first of all, ESG is very broad. So, if you look from a reporting perspective, there's been a number of different ways that, countries, corporates have reported. As you mentioned, there's been the King Code, there's TCFD. So the TCFD is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, is kind of almost become the new standard on how you would report climate change. So, for example, climate change, climate intensity in your portfolio and the like. The idea is very similar to IFRS. What they're trying to do is get to a position where you can compare apples with apples, essentially.
And IFRS has failed to do that. So IFRS is a great example of how not to do it.
But at least as long as everybody understands what an ROE is and an IRR, and that's what they want to get to, is, so for example, if all corporates are reporting on a consistent basis, it makes it a lot easier for the investors to be able to understand who they should be investing or not from an ESG perspective. And that's just from a reporting perspective. But beyond that as well, from the sustainable finance perspective, there's the EU Green Taxonomy. So they put together a green taxonomy to say, this is green and this is not green. These products are relevant, these are not. We've done very similar. We've, in South Africa, got the South African Green Taxonomy, we've kind of leveraged off the EU taxonomy. But to answer your question, is there a global standard? No, there's not. But I think, there will be kind of a funneling towards a global standard.
At the beginning, you started off by talking about the opportunity to leapfrog. The opportunity. We've listened to politicians talking about how we're going to leapfrog the world in terms of fourth industrial revolution, and I'm waiting for that to materialize. But in real terms, we are lagging. How do we get ahead?
I think you've got to look at it on two fronts. One is at a firm level, and I think when you look at competition amongst firms, ESG is probably a 1 in 150 or 200 year opportunity, like you said, to actually leapfrog or change your position in an industry. So if you're an early adopter, and if you, like Ashton said, you take it seriously, you get your plans in place, you bring on board some of the technology needed for this green infrastructure, and you start leading the way, you could find a company that was maybe out of 10 in an industry, somewhere around 6 or 7, could actually start being 3 or 4. Or 2 and 1. Obviously, if you're down at 10, then you first got to fix the business. But someone that's maybe a medium performer, and it's like Formula One, you just can't seem to overtake, because the cars are all going at the same speed, and you just haven't managed to get to the front. This is one of those moments where your opponent maybe is going to take a pit stop, or his road has just been a bit bumpy, and now you can actually overtake. So it's probably one of the greatest opportunities, I'd say, in this generation, for businesses that are serious about leapfrogging, becoming future fit, and changing their position in an industry. Now, if you apply the same thinking to countries, I think the problem with countries, like we said, is where are you relative to others? So, if there's 10 countries, for argument's sake, in the world, and you're number 10 currently, then you first got to fix a few things on the traditional ship. You first got to fix the old model so it works, and then you leapfrog. And I think with developing continents, there's still an element of that. There's still a lot of urbanization that needs to take place. Personal disposable income isn't where it is, and we've just discussed how important that is for consumers adopting these trends at an earlier stage. So there are certain trends that we will consume at a later stage, once it's been mass-produced, etc. But there are also other opportunities, particularly around landscape, biodiversity, etc., that we should be taking the lead in, because we are a lot richer than developing continents in natural resources. So not minerals and commodities, but natural resources like open urban lands, species, etc. So that's now the next wave of ESG that we're seeing coming through is this biodiversity angle. And I think that's where you're going to see developing continents who haven't destroyed as much of their natural habitat as developed continents coming to the fore.
But the same way, you've got to make it worth people's while to buy into this vision. I mean, stop me from buying the plastic bag and stop me from make me take measures in my life or as a supplier in an ecosystem to behave differently so that I get a contract, for example. All of those sorts of incentives can trickle down, I think, quite effectively and actually create maybe even something of a revolution.
So I mean, if you look at a supply chain, so a lot of corporates at the moment are making these net zero commitments. So essentially when you make a net zero commitment, you're committing to scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions being net zero. Your scope 3 emissions includes your supply chain. So by all intensive purposes, if you are a corporate and made that type of commitment, your supply chain also needs to be net zero. So that means their ESG performance is also under scrutiny. Otherwise, you as a corporate will have to offboard them. So, and I think, that's the evolution that's going to happen over the next couple of years, is that we're going to see that entire ecosystem move forward, where corporates are actually going to have to pick and choose suppliers dependent on how they're scoring from an ESG perspective. And therefore, if you are a leader, you're going to pick up more corporate contracts.
It's all well and good to talk. Financial institutions have got the power. They've got enormous capital to deploy appropriately and inappropriately. At what point do you make a decision to cut the bad stuff and add to the good stuff? Don't talk transitions. At some point, you've got to, I don't even want to say the rubber hits the road because I'm not sure that that's sustainable. But where do you draw your line?
So I think from an R&B perspective, what we're trying to do is commit capital towards sustainable finance. So not necessarily looking at kind of penalizing the bad industries at this stage, but more incentivizing the good industries, or those that are moving in the right direction. So, we've put together 200 billion rands of capital over the next 5 years in sustainable finance, that will be allocated.
Is that enough?
Well, let's put it this way. I suspect other financial institutions will do the same. And once you've got that collective capital, inflows of capital, I think it's a step in the right direction. It's a signaling to the market that this is particularly important.
Okay, but 200 billion could become 500 billion.
Correct.
Should the appetite
Be there
and grow?
Yes. So I think that's exactly it. So the idea is, at the moment we're in a position in South Africa where we're trying to catalyze the market. We're trying to move the market forward. We're trying to innovate new products. The more we innovate with new products, the more uptake and interest we have from clients around the new products. So if you look at sustainability-linked bonds, we did the first one last year. The first one was done in the market last year. The first social bond was done last year. But since then, there's been a whole lot more done. So what we're starting to see is the more we allocate that capital to new instruments, the more there's uptake in the market, and you can crowd in additional funding.
What's going to be the tipping point? Ashwin, last point to you. What's going to be the tipping point that actually, where we stop talking about the dream of ESG and we start talking about the reality of ESG? ESG just becomes normal.
I think, Bruce, the scope for non-ESG thinking is closing quickly. Capital flows, regulation, but also talent. New talent, before they join an employer, they want to know that they're working for a responsible employer. They want to know that the sustainability plans are authentic, that they will make a positive difference into the world. So if you're a corporate without an ESG bent, I think there'll be no way for you to hide, to be honest, and you'll go out of business on many fronts. So I think when you say what is the tipping point, I'm not sure, but the walls are closing in on all aspects.
Ashwin, thank you very much indeed. Nigel, thank you. And Ibrahim, thank you very much. And yeah, as the Ukrainian president said when he took over all those years ago, don't put pictures of me on the walls, put pictures of your children and your grandchildren on the walls. You'll think about the future differently when you do it that way.